This complex, colorful creature is a math animal, or manimal, if you will. I have made many of these manimals, and they live together in a mathematical zoo that you can go visit right now. Everything about these objects, their shape and color, and the way they change over time, is defined by a mathematical function, like a good old f of x, but much more complicated than that. With the right functions, you can build anything, because
functions describe the world.
Ain't that the truth? I want to call these hyperdimensional functions, which I hope will piss off mathematicians, because that name doesn't really make sense. Strictly speaking, functions do not have dimensionality. Rather, only their inputs and outputs each have their own dimensionality. We're going to have to start with the basics. This is going to be a mathy one, folks. Hold on to your butts. A function is an input-output machine, numbers in, numbers out. A simple function like f of x takes one number in, x, and produces one number out, y. There is a space of possible input values and a space of possible output values, and the function maps between these spaces. If there is one input, then the input has one dimension. If it has two inputs, then it has two dimensions. You can think of it as a 2D coordinate in 2D space. And the same goes for outputs. If you have three outputs, then they make a 3D coordinate in 3D space. Up to this point, we can still visualize these dimensional spaces and the functions that map between them. But when we add 4 or 5 or 600 dimensions, we leave the comfort of low-dimensional space and we enter hyperspace. These are functions in hyperspace. What the hell does that mean? Well, all it means is that these functions have lots of inputs and lots of outputs, specifically more than 3 on either end. The goal of this video is to maximize dimensionality and pack as many inputs and outputs into a function while still being able to visualize it, to see it, to play with it, and to understand it. To do this, I've made a little web toy that you can go play with and build these hyperdimensional functions yourself. It is basically Desmos on crack. We will play with this more later, but for now, let's build up our intuitions. Visualizing a function means that you are able to see all of its inputs and all of their corresponding outputs, or at least a big chunk of inputs and outputs. So take a simple one-in, one-out function, sine of x. We visualize it by first laying out the inputs on the horizontal axis, and then we feed each input into the function one by one, plotting each output as the height of the line at that point. Now you can see every input mapped to each of their corresponding outputs as a series of xy coordinates. We have visualized sine of x. Now say you want to add a second output, a 1 to 2 function. This means that we need to have a second equation that shares the same input, the same variable x, as the first equation. We'll make this one cosine of x. So now for each one input x, there are two outputs, y1 and y2. How do we visualize this? Well, first, understand that there is no single correct way to visualize a function. There are many different approaches we can take, and some might be better or worse for different purposes. For instance, we could simply show the second output as a second line on the same graph, one line for each output. I don't love this approach because they seem totally disconnected, they may as well be different functions, so instead, let's use a parametric function. To do this, first let's rename our variables. The input should be something arbitrary, let's call it u, and so we can rename the outputs to x and y. We will plot these two outputs as 2D coordinates in 2D space, and we will feed in values of u from 0 to 2 pi. This makes a circle. The input u is no longer the x-axis, but rather an arbitrary range of values. You can think of the set of inputs as a one-dimensional line, where each individual input is the length of the line at that point. We then feed the whole line into the function, which transforms it in 2D space, mapping it out point by point. Pretty cool. Now, what if we have 3 outputs? That means we have a third equation, let's say u over 8, which outputs a third value that we'll call z. Ask yourself, how can we visualize this? Well, 3 outputs makes a 3D coordinate, so we can just plot it out in 3D space. We now have a 3D line, which forms a kind of spring. We can extend the spring out further by increasing the range of u beyond 2 pi. Neato. And what if we add a 4th output? Well, we've reached our limit for now, but later we will find a way around it. First, let's take a step back from adding outputs and focus on adding more inputs. In a sense, all functions are parametric functions because all inputs are parameters. They are just arbitrary values in some given range. Whether you call the input x or u, it's just a value, in this case constrained between positive and negative 4 pi, or the range that happens to fit on the screen. The only difference is in how it's visualized. Here, the input is included as a spatial coordinate in the final line, the x-coordinate. With a parametric function, only the outputs are treated as coordinates located in actual space. The input is merely the length of the line. So let's try adding a new input or parameter, which we will call v. V is a new variable in our equation. We will include it by multiplying by cosine v. For clarity, when you add new inputs, you add new variables. When you add new outputs, you add new equations. For now, we're sticking with one output. With 2 inputs, our input space is not just a line, it is a 2-dimensional plane representing all possible combinations of u and v. When we constrain the ranges of our uv parameters, we see it as a rectangle in this 2D space. To see the output values, let's put the 2D plane in 3D space and visualize the output as the height of the plane at each point. Each uv coordinate has its own corresponding z coordinate. Nice. Alright, now we can take our previous function with 3 outputs and combine it with this new system of 2 inputs to create a 2-in, 3-out function. That means 2 variables and 3 equations. We'll use the function that defines a sphere. Each uv coordinate on the uv plane maps to an xyz coordinate in 3D space, and point by point we can construct a full 3-dimensional surface. This is a parametric surface. The UV parameters again do not reflect absolute locations in 3D space, but rather locations on the surface itself, the length and width of the original plane. Generally, parametric functions can be thought of as taking in some object from input space, in this case a plane, and contorting it in output space. This lets us visualize a total of 5 dimensions, u, v, x, y, and z, for each point on the surface in a fairly intuitive way. But we can do more. Let's consider an alternative way of visualizing the same function. Rather than outputting spatial xyz coordinates, we can instead output color values in the form of red, green, and blue, or RGB. So we can color each point on our uv square using that same sphere function. This is another way to visualize a sphere. It doesn't look like a sphere, but it is mathematically identical. Except in one important way, which is that the color values must be constrained between 0 and 1, so I've scaled and shifted the values into that range. This technique of mapping coordinates to colors is known as a UV map in computer graphics. Now for the fun part. We can combine the outputs XYZ and RGB into the same function to have a total of 6 outputs. To visualize it, we simply use this colored plane as the parametric surface in 3D space. The color values can follow a totally different set of equations with their own independent logic. Output space is now 6-dimensional. We have officially entered hyperspace, and yet we can still easily visualize it. We can also squeeze in one more output color dimension, A, for transparency, RGBA. Transparency is a little glitchy with the software that I'm using, and it can destroy other color values, but it is still useful. That's 7 output dimensions. Not bad. There are still more things we could do to pack more outputs into this function, like using vector fields, but that gets really messy and computationally expensive, so 7 is the most outputs that we'll have in this video. How about adding more inputs? With 2 inputs, u and v, our input object is a UV plane. We can add a third input dimension called w to form a 3D cube as our input object. Or, well, really a volume. Mapping UVW to XYZ coordinates like before would give us a parametric volume, not a surface. Unfortunately, this is visually harder to understand, you can never quite see what's going on inside the volume, and it's also computationally expensive and not well supported by the software I'm using. This rendering is actually just a series of surfaces stacked on top of each other, which hints at a better solution to this problem. To build up to a higher dimension, you must make an infinite stack of slices of the previous dimension. An infinite stack of points makes a line. An infinite stack of lines makes a plane. An infinite stack of planes makes a cube. And an infinite stack of cubes makes a hypercube. Stacks of slices of stacks of slices. And the same goes for functions. A function with one input forms a single line. 2 inputs form a stack of lines, a surface. However, rather than visualizing the entire surface all at once, we can instead view a single slice of that surface in a lower dimension, one line at a time. We do this by holding one variable, v, fixed as a constant value, and we treat only u as the true variable for the current line. We can then walk through different values of v, which changes the line over time. We slide across the surface slice by slice, and in doing so, we get a pretty good image of what the surface looks like, even though we don't see it all at once. And this is how we will stuff more inputs into our already stuffed function. We will spread it out over time. We will add a third input variable t for time, along with the spatial inputs u and v. This is space time. This is that same function for a volumetric ball that we saw earlier, but at the moment we are only looking at one slice of the volume for one specific value of t. As we slide through different values of t, we slide through many different slices of that function, and watch it evolve over time. And remember, the surface does not need to be flat. Here's another function that makes a flower that blooms over time. Its definition is much more complex, but it doesn't really matter. It still only has u, v, and t as inputs, and we can scroll through time in just the same way that you can scrub through a YouTube video. Even though you only see one frame at a time, you still get a pretty good picture of what the whole thing looks like. You could, by the way, use this same technique to visualize output dimensions as well, where you view only a single slice of output space. But this is significantly harder to do for reasons that I won't explain in this video, maybe in a follow-up. With 3 inputs and 7 outputs, we can construct some very complex, colorful functions that evolve over time. Let's take a moment to look over this website. Again, you can go play with this right now. It is basically just Desmos 3D or GeoGebra, but a bit more programmer-friendly with a focus on constructing a single, very complex function. This here is the actual function definition. It is a piece of JavaScript code. It defines a single JavaScript function called surface, which takes an input object called input, and returns a similar output object. Input is a map, and you can get parameter values from it with input.u or input.v or t or whatever you name your extra parameters. The surface function should then return an output object, another map, that expects values for x, y, z, r, g, b, and a. So this one function defines how those inputs are translated to outputs, and you can write whatever code you want in here. The input parameters are defined up here. U and V are always available, and you can set their ranges and their resolution, i.e. the number of points to actually compute for the rendering. Then you can add additional parameters and name them whatever you'd like. Like we can rename t to time if we want, but we also have to change the variable name in the code. The beautiful thing about this paradigm is that we don't have to stop here. We can add as many new parameters as we'd like and stuff in more inputs while still being able to visualize a single slice of the function. Or rather, a slice of a slice of a slice of however many parameters you have. Each new parameter adds a new dimension with its own space to be explored, and the number of combinations of parameters quickly explodes. But we can still walk through each parameter simultaneously and get a decent view of the function as a slice of a slice of a slice. This breaks our previous evolving over time analogy, but instead we can think of each parameter as a control on the function, a knob to be tuned up or down to control the surface. This, by the way, is the same thing as adding a slider in Desmos. Every time you do this, you are actually adding a new variable to the function, but only visualizing a single slice of that function where that variable is kept constant. Using the parameter system, you can add as many inputs as you want. This lets us visualize very high-dimensional objects, like a hypersphere. This is a 5-sphere, meaning it has 5 inputs and 6 outputs. The sphere itself lives in 6-dimensional space. We can roughly visualize it by using our color outputs and by taking one slice at a time. At this point, we really are cheating. Not only can we no longer view the entire function all at once, but we can't even spread it out over a period of time. Even with just a few parameters, we cannot possibly hope to visit every unique combination of parameters. But we can still reasonably navigate the space of parameter combinations and visualize the many strange shapes that they produce. As a very pretty example, let's take a look at shell space. This function has 23 extra input parameters, each controlling a different aspect of the shell. We are currently viewing one possible shell in the space of all possible shells, at least with this function definition. Again, think of each parameter as a control knob. This one controls the spikiness of the surface, this one controls the rate of spiral growth, this one controls the direction of the spiral, etc. We can take a tour of shell space by walking through all the parameters simultaneously. Trippy. It's a little overwhelming, actually. By the way, I stole these equations from a very cool website that you should go check out. One of the motivations of this project was to build very biological-looking functions. I kept looking at jellyfish and aquariums and thinking, there's gotta be a function that looks like this. Most of my ideas come from aquariums, apparently. And the biological analogy runs quite deep. Here, the parameters are like the genes of the shell, and evolution would explore different sets of genes, or different sets of parameters. Really, the parameters and the function definition itself are the literal genetic code, or genotype, and the colorful shape they produce is the phenotype. You can find a large selection of pre-made functions down here. This is the zoo. Oh look, here's a jellyfish. You can also save and download your creations, and load them up later, or share the save files online. I'll make a channel on my Discord to share any cool functions you make. Link in the description. And a couple other pointers for the UI. Here in the output section, you can choose to convert the output XYZ coordinates to spherical coordinates, radius theta phi, or to cylindrical coordinates, rho phi z. These can make some shapes easier to build. And you can also translate the color outputs RGB to HSV, which can make some colorations easier. Both of these conversions require no changes to the code itself. You only ever return XYZ RGB, and the conversion happens afterwards. Just some quality of life stuff. In the function definition itself, you can go pretty wild. You can use loops and if statements and random numbers and helper functions outside the main function if you want. The code is literally injected directly into the web page, so you can make it do all kinds of stupid stuff. Have fun with that. I have made the math library available, lowercase m, which lets you use matrices and imaginary numbers and complex numbers, so you can make fractals or chaotic functions or do numeric integration. Like this fractal is made with the Weierstrass function. This ocean planet uses turbulence. And this is the Mandelbulb, which is unfortunately very slow. Depending on the code, it can be very computationally intense, so it might be pretty choppy, especially if you're running on lower-end hardware. You can reduce the UV resolution to improve performance. The default sphere function has a bunch of comments that explain most of these details, and it also doubles as a prompt that you can copy and send off to your favorite chatbot. You can ask an AI to write a function and then copy what it gives you and paste it back in here. You should also give it some context for what parameters are available and what shape you want to see. I actually used it to directly generate save files, which are just JSON files containing all the code and parameters. That is a little more convenient. If you're a certified AI hater, you don't have to use AI at all, but this seems like a pretty justified use case. Just know I did use AI heavily to make this website. This is essentially 3D modeling software with like an old school PS2 graphics vibe. You can construct any continuous shape with any color. Here's a hot dog. Isn't math beautiful? And this speaks to my second motivation for making this project, which was to be able to visualize neural networks with lots of inputs and outputs. In the logic of the function, you can program a whole neural network, which is just a function. Neural networks are universal function approximators. I have a few videos on this. That means that they can construct any conceivable function, so long as it has enough parameters. And very naturally, you can add a bunch of tunable parameters using this system. This here is a perceptron, or a single-layer neural network. It can only make a flat plane with simple gradient colors. With this many inputs and outputs, it has many parameters which can control the various weights and biases that control the shape of the plane. This one is a multi-layer perceptron, an MLP, which has way more parameters, too many to expose in the UI. Instead, I've added a seed parameter, which simply seeds a random number generator that fills in all the weights and biases. So by walking through different seeds, you can walk through the space of possible neural networks. As I've explained in other videos, this is not the only architecture that achieves universal function approximation. Here's one that uses the Taylor series, an infinite sum of polynomials. And here's one that uses the Fourier series, an infinite sum of sines and cosines. You can construct all kinds of wacky, weird, and wild things here, so go play around with it. I will let you explore these hyperdimensional spaces, and I hope you get a little bit lost. I am sure there's all kinds of mathy insights that I'm missing out on here. I can always count on math nerds to let me know that I'm stupid in the comments. Please do that, it drives engagement. Tell me all about manifolds and knots and Bernoulli's last theorem of perfect circumcision or whatever. But actually, there probably are all kinds of tips and tricks from topology and knot theory. I wonder, for instance, if it's possible to build surfaces that will always be symmetrical, or that won't overlap with themselves, or that always have their edges perfectly lined up so they're not sort of broken on the seams like this. Let me know. If you like my work and you want to support me, you can join my Patreon, or buy me a coffee, or use this link from Scrimba to learn how to code and get a 20% discount on a pro subscription. Alright, I'll see you next year. Happy holidays, folks. Merry Christmas.
Functions describe the world. I start most of my courses that way.